The story begins with Yoo-won, a 4-year-old Korean boy, sitting with an English book. His mother, surprised, tells his father that their child is reading a book in its original language. His father, equally astonished, replies proudly that their son must be a genius. However, when Yoo-won speaks in 3 different languages, his father is confused. He asks how their son knows languages from countries he has never seen and wonders aloud how this could be possible, especially since neither parent has taught him. Suddenly, the room door bursts open, and Yoo-won's grandfather enters with great pride, declaring that Yoo-won has inherited the thick bloodline of their ancestors. With booming excitement, the grandfather announces that at last, a child has been born who will fulfill their family's long-cherished wish, the child who will reclaim the Tower of Babel for their family. He holds Yoo-won's big sister, Yumi, as he shares his excitement. However, Yoo-won's parents merely stare at the overzealous grandfather. His mother calmly tells him that he's starting again and calls Yumi over to her. Yoo-won's father, on the other hand, advises his grandfather to wash up, a suggestion that irritates the older man. The grandfather shouts in frustration that the Tower of Babel truly exists, but Yoo-won's father only laughs and agrees lightly while Yoo-won's mother cleans up Yumi, asking her if she had fun playing with her grandfather. The grandfather then grabs a notebook and asks to borrow it. He begins writing, explaining that long ago, in a chaotic world, the great ancestor of the Ban family possessed the ability to make everyone understand each other. He shows Yoo-won a drawing, explaining that with this power, their ancestor led the people and built a tower that would never collapse. This was the Tower of Babel. Yoo-won, confused, asks his grandfather if the tower built by their ancestor was just a building. He also wonders if their ancestor was simply a landlord, thinking about money. His grandfather laughs and explains that their ancestor was the master of languages, able to interpret and transform all languages. He stresses that they must never forget that they are descendants of such a great person. However, Yoo-won only asks again where their building is, as his father reminds the grandfather to wash up. The grandfather, ignoring the request, admits that he doesn't know where the tower is, to which Yoo-won sighs, still believing it's just a building. His grandfather then grabs him, confidently stating that once they find it, their family will regain all its power and glory. As a child, Yoo-won always hoped that his extraordinary linguistic talent could help fulfill his family's long-held dream, but his ability far surpassed their expectations. As time passed, he became more focused on his own path. One day, while sitting in his room, Yoo-won reviewed his test scores, certain he had done well enough to pass. He refreshed his computer screen, anxiously awaiting the results of his application to the Political Science and Diplomacy department at S University. Frustrated by the delay, his laptop suddenly glitched, causing him to panic. As he wondered what was happening, a blue system screen appeared on his malfunctioning laptop. Yoo-won stared at it, bewildered, wondering why there was a strange blue window in front of him. He tried to touch it, but his hand passed through the image. As he looked closer, he realized the writing was twisted in a language he had never seen before. He stared at the system, reading the words that declared it to be the best academy in an alternate dimension. It congratulated him on passing the document screening, causing him to stand up in shock and horror, wondering what it was and how he could even read it. The system then popped up again, informing him that he had been summoned to the practical evaluation venue. If he passed, he would become a prospective student, and he was told to prepare himself. A countdown appeared, starting from 10 seconds. Frantically, he looked around, shouting, asking who was playing a prank on him. He called out to his sister, Yumi, telling her to come out, promising to let it slide if she did. Suddenly, he heard a notification that caught his attention. When he looked back, he saw that it was an acceptance letter from the Political Science and Diplomacy major. He was excited but not surprised, as he had expected to pass. In his excitement, he completely ignored the countdown, which had reached 2 seconds behind him. After the 10 seconds elapsed, the system gave him 5 additional seconds to prepare for transportation to the exam venue. When the countdown hit 0, the system notified him that the practical evaluation had begun, and he was summoned to the venue. Despite everything happening, he thought he must be imagining things. At that moment, Yumi entered his room, excitedly calling his name and asking if he had passed. But before he could respond, he disappeared, leaving Yumi confused and calling out for him. On the other side, Yoo-won found himself transported to the evaluation venue, landing hard on the ground. The system informed him that the special practical evaluation for candidates from lower dimensions had begun. He was completely bewildered, wondering if he had truly been summoned. Noticing the throbbing pain in his head, he realized it wasn't a game or illusion, it was real. The system then instructed him to defeat the blind goblin and destroy the dungeon core. Yoo-won shouted in frustration, asking what they meant by practical evaluation and special exam. He angrily protested that he had never even applied and demanded they send him back. Suddenly, something huge appeared behind him, stopping him mid-shout. He turned around in horror and couldn't believe his eyes. The goblins were real. One of the blind goblins mentioned hearing a human voice, and another responded, saying the prey was nearby. Yoo-won quickly covered his mouth, backing away silently while wondering if they were talking about him. To his shock, he realized he could now understand what the goblins were saying. He remembered the system's message about the practical evaluation, the blind goblins, and the dungeon core. He began to wonder what was happening. Did he really have to defeat those creatures to escape? It all felt like something straight out of a game or novel, but the pain in his head and the sense of reality around him told him otherwise. Even though he didn't fully understand what was going on, he knew it was real. Yoo-won looked at the goblins who were searching around and recalled the phrase blind goblins. He thought that if he wanted to get out of there, he would have to fight them. But as he lay on the ground in frustration, he couldn't help but wonder how he was supposed to defeat them when modern people couldn't even be sure of beating a chihuahua. Suddenly, one of the goblins swung its club near Yoo-won, shocking him. He wondered what the hell the creature was and whether it could see him. But as he observed their movements, he realized they were just swinging their hammers aimlessly. They couldn't see him. He composed himself, knowing he couldn't afford to panic. However, one of the goblins heard his footsteps and rushed toward him, swinging its wooden club in his direction. Fortunately, he jumped away just in time to avoid the attack. He fell to the ground, covering his mouth tightly with both hands to stop himself from screaming. The goblin reacted in surprise, prompting the other goblin to ask what was wrong. The first goblin replied that it had heard a sound from that direction. The second goblin asked if it was sure, and the first insisted that it definitely came from there, urging the other not to let it escape. Meanwhile, Yoo-won lay motionless on the ground, trying to calm himself down. He quickly realized that the goblins were blind, but they had heightened sensitivity to sound and movement. They seemed to hunt by cornering their prey through communication, which meant that no matter how well he hid, they would eventually find him. Slowly sitting up, he knew that if he didn't want to die, he needed to think fast. He decided to exploit the goblins' habits. Grabbing a few stones nearby, Yoo-won knew there was no time to waste. It was time to act. He threw the stones in different directions, successfully diverting the goblins' attention. The goblins rushed toward the noise, and when the second goblin reached the spot, it touched the ground, only to discover that it was just stones. Seizing the opportunity, Yoo-won grabbed a large rock nearby and threw it at the second goblin's head. The second goblin, thinking the prey was approaching from behind, swung its club wildly, hitting the first goblin square in the head. He then shouts in their language that the prey was resisting. In a fit of rage, the first goblin tightened its grip on its club and struck the second goblin's head with brutal force. The blow crushed the second goblin's skull, killing it instantly. The weight of the second goblin's body fell on top of the first, pinning it to the ground. Yoo-won couldn't believe what had just happened. However, he quickly noticed the first goblin struggling beneath the corpse of the second, trying to free itself. The goblin's head finally emerged from under the body, and it felt something in front of it. Yoo-won, holding the club. Apologizing to the goblin, he explained that it had tried to kill him, so it must have expected this outcome. Yoo-won raised the club, telling himself not to hesitate. If he couldn't finish off even this dying creature, he had no chance of getting out alive. Summoning all his strength, he struck the goblin with all his might, finally managing to kill it. He thought to himself, "For now, I survived." Suddenly, the corpses of the goblins began to glow, and strange words appeared, floating out of their bodies. Panicking, Yoo-won asked aloud what was happening. The system popped up again, congratulating him on his first successful hunt in the dungeon. As a reward, he was granted the power of the higher dimension. The glowing words swirled around his hand, and he stared at them, confused, wondering what they meant. The system then displayed that the power of the Babylonian code had been unlocked. It explained that this power would be expressed through ideograms, a form of language familiar to the user. Yoo-won wondered what ideograms familiar to him meant, but the system soon clarified that Chinese characters had been registered. Unlike phonetic characters that represent sounds, these ideograms conveyed meaning directly through their form. The system also revealed that from the two goblins, the concepts of demon and life had been seized from their flesh, while other concepts were too complex or insignificant for his current level to absorb. He realized this ability was about more than just language. It was about extracting and absorbing concepts from things. The system then indicated that he was absorbing 0.2 demon, explaining that demons, as a concept, are inherently something humans cannot possess. It recommended storing or separating it in the Babylonian code and applying it to other objects. Yoo-won wondered whether he could keep or apply the concept, and if he should try it on himself. He then absorbed 0.4 life, which increased his life force to 10.4. After absorbing it, the system showed that his overall abilities and potential had been enhanced. He marveled at how much more confident he felt. Next, he absorbed 0.2 flesh, increasing his physical health to 10.2, which in turn made his body stronger. He opened and closed his hands, realizing that his grip strength, leg strength, skin, everything had significantly improved. After absorbing the concepts from the goblins, he fully understood his power to recognize, seize, and absorb the essence of various concepts. He then walked over to the remaining club, noting that the goblin corpses had disappeared after their abilities were absorbed, leaving only 2 clubs behind. As he bent down to pick up one of the clubs, he thought about applying concepts not just to himself, but to objects as well. If that worked, he might be able to escape the dungeon. Smiling to himself, he extracted the demon concept and infused it into the wooden club, confidently convincing himself that he could do it now that the goblins were dead. A short while later, using his newly unlocked powers, Yoo-won quickly cleared the blind goblin dungeon and destroyed the dungeon core. The system congratulated him for passing the practical test of the lower dimension special examination. Exhaling in relief, he wondered if this meant he could finally go home. However, the system informed him that he would now be transferred to the dormitory. Shocked, he realized that instead of going home, he was being sent to a place he had never seen before, a world called Union Academy. Confused, Yoo-won wondered where he was. The system congratulated him again on passing the practical exam and becoming a provisional student. It instructed him to wear the assigned uniform neatly and attend the upcoming interviews. Perplexed, he wondered what the system meant by interview. But before he could ask further questions, the system repeated that he should wear the proud uniform of Union Academy. Frustrated, he shouted that he had just passed the entrance exam, and now he was expected to wear a uniform again. Tearfully, he cried out for his freshman days, lamenting how ridiculous the situation was. Still, he begrudgingly put on the uniform, grumbling about how they had put him in a life-threatening situation, and now expected him to attend an interview. Once he was dressed, he stepped out of the room, swearing to himself that when he met the person in charge, he was definitely going to give them a piece of his mind. Yoo-won rushed to the interview room, bursting through the door with thoughts of demanding compensation for his transportation. However, he stopped abruptly when he saw a beautiful woman inside, leaving him momentarily speechless. Her beauty captivated him, though he quickly noticed her light green skin, making him wonder if she was an alien. Despite this, she was undeniably striking. She welcomed him warmly and introduced herself as Yumina, the professor of magic combat at Union Academy. He shyly responded with a stammered greeting. Yumina congratulated him on passing the practical exam and welcomed him back, to which he nervously thanked her. She then asked if he was aware that his test had caught the full attention of the faculty, leaving him confused. Smiling, she told him that he was the first student in 500 years to create a new artifact during the evaluation. Yoo-won remained silent, thinking to himself that whether it was 500 years or not, he had been brought there without knowing anything and had almost died. She continued, praising him for being truly remarkable and explaining that his case was exceptional, even beyond the special examination. Yoo-won figured that maybe their thinking was different since they were from different worlds, and he noted how strange the school seemed. He decided to leave as soon as the interview was over, but before he could, something outside the window caught his attention. He asked Yumina about a particular pillar he could see. She looked outside and remarked that people from lower dimensional worlds often knew nothing about the Union or the pillar, and confirmed his suspicion. She explained that the pillar was the reason Union Academy was established. It served as the source of their mission to raise the most talented students across dimensions and help them reach the top of the tower. The pillar represented the ultimate goal of Union Academy and the shared hope of all dimensions. She then told him that the pillar was the dungeon among dungeons, the origin of all mysteries and dangers in their world, and that it was called the Tower of Babel. Yoo-won couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was the same building his grandfather had always talked about, the Tower of Babel. He asked himself what was going on and if everything his ancestors had said was true. When he heard Yumina describe it as the Dungeon of Dungeons, he wondered if strange monsters had taken over the tower. Still, he decided not to dwell on it. What mattered most was reclaiming the glory of his family and restoring their legacy. Right then and there, Yoo-won decided to enroll in Union Academy. Thanks to the professor's special treatment, he was sent back home. After gathering his entire family and explaining everything that had happened, his grandfather excitedly shouted, asking if he had finally found the Tower of Babel. His grandfather praised him for doing such a great job, while his father tried to calm the old man down. With his family's support, Yoo-won began his preparations for enrollment. Now, in the lower dungeon of Union Academy, inside the Hobgoblin Cave, Yoo-won was preparing for the next stage of his training. He retrieved a gun from his inventory and began shooting the goblins in front of him, killing them instantly and with ease. He didn't stop firing, knowing that he had only limited his abilities to language before. Now, after absorbing the concepts from numerous goblins, he had seized 3.4 demon, 6.8 life, 3.4 flesh, 0.34 murder, and 0.57 shooting. Everything had changed completely. Yoo-won could verbalize, absorb, and manipulate the concepts of all objects, and when he defeated an enemy, he acquired the concepts he recognized. The more concepts he obtained, the stronger he became. The first dungeon he cleared, the Blind Goblin Cave, gave him his first artifact. He had imbued a club with the concepts he acquired, strengthening it into a weapon, a metal club that was currently blocking a sneak attack from a goblin behind him. Infused with ghostly energy, it was the first artifact he created. The club could reveal its true form at the owner's command, transforming and acting autonomously. Yoo-won hugged the club, sweetly praising it, knowing that thanks to this artifact, created by chance, he had earned a good evaluation result. After confirming that no goblins remained standing, Yoo-won decided to sort through the spoils and check his code. To his surprise, among the concepts he obtained from the monsters, there was one he had never seen before: soul. Curious, he wondered what it could mean. Just then, his club moved to get his attention. He asked it what was wrong, and if it wanted the soul concept, to which the club nodded. Yoo-won chuckled, telling it to wait a moment and promising to imbue it with life, ghost, and spirit as well. Following what he had learned so far, Yoo-won took out all the small concepts he had acquired and began imbuing them into the club. As he did so, the club emitted a bright light, and the system notified him that the combined concepts had formed a perfect harmony, triggering a transformation in the artifact. The system revealed that Ghost 2.5 and Beast 4 had automatically combined, resulting in a synergy that far surpassed the current depth of his knowledge. Shocked, Yoo-won wondered if one of the concepts he had left alone had suddenly transformed. The area was enveloped in a brilliant blue light as the transcendental fusion completed, resulting in a new form, Ghost Beast 10. His club transformed into a white snake. Yoo-won realized that combining the concepts of Ghost and Beast had created a Ghost Beast, an outcome that felt like something out of a fantasy novel. Curious, Yoo-won reached out to touch the snake, but hesitated, fearing it might bite him. Sensing his hesitation, the snake gently touched his hand, sweetly reassuring him. Yoo-won realized that its personality remained the same as before, but he still wondered if it could transform into a magic gun or a shield like it once did. Smiling, he told the snake that its name would now be Eve, and they would check its growth stats before heading back. The system displayed his updated stats. Life had increased by 45.1, flesh by 32, soul by 324.5, magic by 38.7, swordsmanship by 14.2, leadership by 1, all-seeing eyes by 105, all-hearing ears and all-speaking lips by 100. Reflecting on these changes, Yoo-won noted that life seemed to function like a level in a game, while flesh represented his physical stats. He was puzzled by why his soul stat was so high, but guessed that the abilities like all-seeing eyes, all-hearing ears, and all-speaking lips were probably related to his language skills. Deciding to skip over what he didn't fully understand, he focused on what he could grasp. He then turned to Eve and asked if it thought they could surprise everyone with its new form. Eve shook its head in response. Chuckling, Yoo-won reassured it, saying that what really mattered was their growth rate. Just then, the system asked if he would like to return, as the dungeon core had been destroyed. Yoo-won clicked yes and, smiling, told Eve that it was time to head to the Union Academy entrance ceremony. Later, at the Union Academy auditorium, where entrance ceremonies were held, students were filing in and taking their seats. Suddenly, Yoo-won appeared in the middle of the room, causing a wave of shock to ripple through the crowd. He, however, was amazed to see so many people around. Activating his all-seeing eyes, an ability that allowed him to read everything and, depending on his proficiency, understand the aura and spirit of a target more deeply, he scanned the room. As expected, unlike him, who had been admitted through the special process for students from lower dimensions, the regular students who had entered through the standard admission process looked incredibly strong. Even at a glance, Yoo-won estimated that they were at least 10 times stronger than him. He looked around, trying to figure out where his seat was, when a loud voice called out to him from behind. A huge guy sneered at him, shouting that if he was from a lower dimension, he should stop wandering around and just get lost over there. Other students around them joined in, mockingly laughing at him. Yoo-won, unbothered, simply walked away, replying with a casual sure and thanking the guy. He had expected that those who came through the regular admission process would have high opinions of themselves and would discriminate against him because he was from a lower dimension. As he walked, Yoo-won realized that, even in this academy, those with power and strength looked down on others. He wondered if this was a universal truth, something that existed wherever people lived. Suddenly, someone called out to him again, referring to him as a special admission student, and instructed him to sit in a designated area. Curious, Yoo-won approached, wondering if this was where the special admission students from lower dimensions were supposed to sit. As he walked closer, he couldn't help but feel like an outcast. But when he activated his all-seeing eyes to assess the other students sitting in the section, he froze in shock. Their stats were far beyond what he had expected. He wondered if these people were really special admission students from lower dimensions because their stats were A, S, SS, and none were lower than grade B. Yoo-won was astonished, realizing that these students were likely strong enough to wipe the floor with many of the regular students who had mocked him earlier. Yoo-won called out to a Slight, asking him if this was their designated seating area. He remarked how amazing the special seats were, which made a Slight stammer as he asked what Yoo-won meant by amazing. A Slight, whose name was a play on his light, was Yoo-won's handsome roommate whom he had met at the dorm before the entrance ceremony. However, their first encounter had been rather unusual. A few days earlier, a Slight had pointed a sword at Yoo-won, shouting and demanding to know who he was. Yoo-won, terrified at the sight of the sharp blade, had shouted back that he was a freshman, judging by his clothes, which meant he was a Slight's roommate. A Slight had quickly sheathed the sword and apologized, explaining that he had just finished a practical evaluation, so his nerves were on edge. He then asked Yoo-won if he was okay. Yoo-won had noticed that a Slight looked like a prince from a fairy tale, with a quiet demeanor. Still, considering a Slight had apologized first, Yoo-won had thought that maybe he wasn't such a bad guy after all. After Yoo-won explained his story to a Slight teasingly asked if Yoo-won's practical exam involved hunting goblins. He added that even a recruit with basic training could hunt a goblin easily, whereas his own exam opponents were trolls and ogres. This comment irritated Yoo-won, making him think that a Slight was completely oblivious, 100% oblivious. Yoo-won then suggested they should wash up, noting that it had been a while since he'd had a proper conversation with anyone. A Slight agreed, saying he felt the same way. As Yoo-won began to undress, he casually mentioned that the dorm shower was communal. He didn't notice a slight shock behind him. Yoo-won turned back and suggested they continue their conversation while showering. But a Slight, blushing furiously, stammered that Yoo-won should go first. Confused, Yoo-won stared at him as a Slight turned away, stuttering that he would join in a bit. The awkwardness was palpable, and Yoo-won couldn't help but feel uncomfortable too. Now, back in the auditorium, Yoo-won was still feeling that awkwardness when he saw a Slight. He assumed that if this was the designated seating area for special admission students, the two girls seated nearby must be special students as well. Waving to them, he greeted them with a cheerful hello. One of the girls responded with a friendly hi, and when Yoo-won glanced at her, he was struck by how cute she was. Embarrassed, he quickly looked away, muttering that it was nice to meet her. He then remembered the other girl and greeted her as well, but he froze in horror when he saw her dark eyes staring intently at him. Alarmed, he asked her what was wrong, to which she calmly replied that the object wrapped around his arm was interesting. Realizing she was talking about Eve, he takes out his artifact and asked if she meant Eve. The others all looked at Eve in amazement. A Slight asked if that was the same artifact from before, marveling at how much it had changed in just a few days. The girl with pink hair asked if she could touch Eve, exclaiming that it was just too cute. Meanwhile, the white-haired girl smiled at their reactions and introduced herself as Dogko Yoo-won, the daughter of a martial artist. Yoo-won then asked for Yoo-won's name. He introduced himself as Ban Yoo-won and, curious about her background, asked if she used martial arts or something similar, like shooting energy blasts. This question made everyone laugh. Yoo-won, trying to stifle her own laughter, replied that his understanding wasn't entirely wrong. Yoo-won grinned and said that since they were already in a fantasy world, it made sense that martial arts would exist too. The pink-haired girl then introduced herself as Rachel. A Slight also formally introduced himself and greeted Rachel and Yoo-won, though Yoo-won simply turned around, causing some awkwardness. Trying to break the tension, Yoo-won pointed out that it looked like the ceremony was about to begin. Yoo-won noticed Yumina standing at the front of the auditorium, prompting a Slight to ask if he had also consulted with her. Yoo-won replied that he had, and asked if a Slight had been consulted by her as well. Before a Slight could answer, a bright light suddenly appeared above them. They looked up and saw the auditorium ceiling opening, causing everyone to wonder what was going on. Suddenly, a booming voice declared that everyone had gathered, and a powerful pressure descended on the room. The intensity of it caused severe pain, and many students, including Rachel and a Slight, bent over in agony, clutching their bodies. Yoo-won, holding his head, wondered what this overwhelming force was. He looked up, realizing that the pressure was coming from the sky. The voice then announced the start of the entrance ceremony for the 2557th Union Academy class. As Yoo-won gazed upward, he noticed something massive towering above them. Later, Yumina excitedly asked them if they had been impressed, explaining that it was the principal's speech. Most of them remained silent, but Yoo-won replied that it had been incredible and then asked if the giant eye in the sky was the principal. This question shocked everyone. Yumina, surprised, asked if he had really seen the eye. A Slight, stunned, confirmed if Yoo-won had looked up. A Slight mentioned that the experience was terrifying, and Rachel added that most people are too intimidated to even look up at the sky. But Yoo-won simply asked if it was really that frightening. Yoo-won, who had been watching him, stared in disbelief. She knew the principal was capable of concealing himself completely using some special method, and she wondered how on earth Yoo-won had managed to see him. Feeling a strange gaze behind him, Yoo-won turned and was alarmed to find Yeon staring at him. Nervously, he explained that he had just felt like a giant eye was watching them. Yumina then confirmed that the giant eye was indeed the principal. She added that they probably wouldn't see him again unless they achieved something extraordinary or caused an incident. Jokingly, she remarked that it seemed like Yoo-won might have a private meeting with the principal. Yoo-won, alarmed, asked if that was more of a curse than a blessing. Laughing, Yumina replied that the students' achievements were also her own as their professor, so they should work hard. At that moment, a Slight realized something and asked if Yumina was going to be in charge of them. Yumina confirmed this, causing a Slight to express surprise that one of the only 9 full professors at the academy would be overseeing them. Yumina simply smiled and asked if she should introduce herself formally. She then introduced herself as Professor Yumina, specializing in magic combat, and explained that she would be their homeroom professor for the next 5 years in Class 11. She encouraged them to work well together. A Slight, still surprised, asked if it was true that lower-tier special admissions students were typically assigned to associate professors. Yumina agreed, adding that this was normally the case. However, she explained that they were an exceptionally special group of students that year, so she had been given the responsibility. She thought to herself how strange it was that only students like them had been selected. As they gathered, Yumina offered them a piece of advice: they should be cautious of jealousy and hostility from the regular students. This warning shocked Yoo-won. He understood that the jealousy and hostility Yumina mentioned went beyond academic competition. It referred to physical confrontations and fights between students, matters outside the realm of internal competition regulated by the school's rules, things even professors couldn't interfere with. Yumina then told them that from now on, the 4 of them should stick together. As rare special admission students, if they wanted to grow by challenging other students, they would either need to be strong enough to withstand the jealousy and hostility or risk disappearing altogether. She added that they were also party members who would climb the Tower of Babel together until graduation. Snapping her fingers, Yumina announced that the serious talk was over and the academy had prepared a small gift for them all. She promised to explain the rules and details after they received their artifacts. With a flick of her wrist, she revealed several bright artifacts, leaving them all in shock. A moment later, a Slight, holding a necklace with a red stone pendant, asked if it was a student ID. He guessed that it functioned like a pendant, and they recalled Yumina's earlier explanation that the student ID could be used to identify themselves and access all the campus facilities. She had also mentioned that it allowed them to teleport anywhere within the Union realm. Testing it out, a Slight commented, "Professor Yumina is beautiful," and immediately the ID teleported them outside. Rachel followed suit, saying, "Professor Yumina is beautiful," and they were teleported back inside. Sighing in frustration, they realized how easily the teleportation function could be triggered. A Slight then pointed out that they needed to keep their student IDs with them at all times, especially if they wanted to enter the tower. Like it or not, they'd have to take good care of it. Rachel then asked why Yoo-won had been left behind alone, but a Slight shrugged, saying no one knew. Yeon speculated that perhaps even that powerful being, the principal, had sensed something about him. She then remembered Yumina casually picking up the phone earlier, saying to someone on the other line that they were just about to have a tea party. Yeon knew that, out of all the students, Yoo-won was the only one who had been singled out, and she couldn't help but wonder who else could look directly at the principal like he did. Meanwhile, Yoo-won was sitting alone in a room, sweating and anxiously waiting for someone. He couldn't believe that on the first day, he was having a private meeting with the principal. He hadn't caused any trouble, so he couldn't understand why. Suddenly, the principal's voice addressed him, reassuring him that it was fine to look directly at him because his true form wasn't present. Yoo-won asked the principal if he should address him as Chancellor, but the principal responded, instructing him to call him Master. Yoo-won nodded and replied, "Yes, Master." The principal then explained that he normally doesn't interfere with the growth of students. If they are weak, he leaves them weak. If they are strong, he leaves them strong. Whether they die in the tower or survive to seize power and glory, he does not care. His only goal is to witness, with his own eyes, the one who reaches the end of the tower. To him, everything else is meaningless. Yoo-won stared at the principal in silence, wondering what he meant by meaningless. He knew that, for his family, the tower held deep significance. From the time of his ancestors, the Ban family had been determined to reclaim the tower's power and glory. Yoo-won himself was prepared to risk his life to achieve this. But he began to wonder, what does the tower mean to the other students? What does it mean to the principal? Curious, Yoo-won called out to the principal and asked why so many people from different dimensions came to climb the tower. What exactly was the tower? The principal paused for a moment before responding, explaining that the tower was a path to the divine, a trial. Yoo-won was surprised and wondered if the principal meant something akin to what people usually think of as divine. The complexity of the situation was dawning on him. The principal continued, explaining that this was why he typically didn't interfere with the students' hardships. However, this time, he would make an exception. Yoo-won looked at the principal, confused and expecting further explanation. The principal then clarified that he saw potential in Yoo-won, the greatest potential he had ever witnessed. Suddenly, Yoo-won's student ID lit up. The principal informed him that he had made arrangements to help him prepare for climbing the tower. Yoo-won stared at his ID in surprise, stuttering as he asked what was happening. The principal explained that he had expanded Yoo-won's exploration privileges beyond the academy. Now, Yoo-won could travel to any dungeon outside the academy, and he should use this opportunity to hone his skills before attempting the tower. Yoo-won asked if the principal meant that he could venture outside the academy. The principal confirmed this and added that their conversation was over, Yoo-won could leave now. Suddenly, a hole appeared beneath him, shocking him. But before Yoo-won was transported, the principal advised him to improve his skills, and if his progress was remarkable, he would unlock the next privilege for him. When Yoo-won asked what that privilege was, the principal revealed that it would be solo exploration of the tower, leaving him speechless. The principal then bid him farewell, saying he looked forward to their next meeting. Yoo-won was then dragged out of the principal's office and thrown into someone. Yumina laughed and asked how his meeting with the principal had gone. When he realized he had collided with Yumina, he immediately jumped back, blushing in embarrassment. She remarked that the principal always dismisses visitors in such a fashion and jokingly asked if she was right about his strange personality. Yoo-won nervously agreed, and she laughed again, telling him that the principal had been waiting specifically for him from the very start. A moment later, Yumina looked at Yoo-won's pendant ID and couldn't believe that the principal had granted him permission to leave the academy. He asked her if it was a big deal and explained that the principal had told him to quickly improve his lacking skills. Yumina replied that it was a huge deal and explained that he could now freely explore external dungeons outside the tower and visit external cities at will. This meant he would gain far more experience and preparation than other students, a privilege that was unprecedented for a regular student. Yoo-won awkwardly responded that he understood. In his mind, Yoo-won thought it was the principal's way of saying he was weak and needed extra training. But as Yumina continued, he realized it wasn't quite like that. She told him that he was incredibly lucky and that she was envious of his newfound freedom, leaving him looking at her in confusion. She then explained that professors are usually too busy to leave the academy during this time, to which he stammered, asking if that was really the case. She confirmed it, adding that since the Union is an academy, everything is designed with students in mind, which can be somewhat inconvenient for the professors. Yoo-won replied that he understood. Yumina excitedly continued, telling him that he would be able to explore dungeons, visit external cities during his spare time, and stroll through various shops. She even added, with a hint of jealousy, that he could enjoy as many snacks as he wanted. She recommended a nice external city called Ronica, where he could find great things. Yoo-won, sweating nervously, asked if he should bring her something to stop her from feeling too envious. Later, as he stepped out of the academy, Yoo-won noticed the weather was beautiful. He recalled Yumina enthusiastically telling him that honeymoon wine made by temple priests was fantastic, known for its sweet fruity aroma, rich bubbles, and lingering aftertaste. She had jokingly asked him to bring her 2 bottles. He thought to himself how strange this other world was, a professor asking a student to run errands for alcohol. Still, he was thankful he had received an inventory in advance. As he opened his inventory, he noticed an item that his grandfather had given him during his brief visit home before enrolling. It was a consumable item with unknown rarity. A few days earlier, his grandfather had approached him and asked if he was well prepared to leave. Yoo-won had replied yes and asked his grandfather if he had slept well. Instead of answering, his grandfather had put down a bag and told him it was perfect timing and that he could take as much as he wanted. Curious, Yoo-won asked what was inside. His grandfather just smiled and told him to open the bag and find out. When Yoo-won opened it, he was amazed to find gold bars inside. He asked in disbelief if they were pure gold and if he was really allowed to take them. His grandfather assured him that it was fine. Those gold bars were the legacies of their ancestors who had devoted themselves to finding the Tower of Babel. Now, they were all Yoo-won's to use freely. With tears in his eyes, Yoo-won thanked his grandfather, saying the gold would be incredibly helpful and that he truly appreciated it. But then he hesitated, asking his grandfather if it wasn't a bit too much to carry around. His grandfather was taken aback and asked why. Yoo-won explained that it seemed heavy to lug around everywhere, which made his grandfather furious. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Yoo-won smiled, thinking back to how he used to find the gold heavy. But now, with his inventory, it was incredibly convenient, everything fit inside perfectly. Since his grandpa had mentioned that gold was valuable everywhere, he decided to take a few chunks. After securing some gold, he placed them in his jacket and completed his preparations. Feeling ready, he thought to himself that it was time to step foot into a new world. A moment later, he arrived in the city and noticed that, despite being in another dimension, the cityscape looked quite similar to what he was used to. However, when he saw cars flying through the sky, he realized just how different this world was. Staring at the flying vehicles in amazement, he wondered how they worked. Just then, someone called out to him from behind, asking where he was from since they hadn't seen him around before. Yoo-won turned around in confusion, and the guards who had approached him noticed his uniform. They immediately recognized him as a Union Academy student, saluted him, and greeted him respectfully. They introduced themselves as the guards responsible for the western boundary of Ronica, the Academy's city. Yoo-won awkwardly greeted them back and introduced himself as a first-year student at Union Academy. The guards asked how he had arrived in the city and whether he had permission from the principal. He replied that he did, and that the principal had granted him the freedom to explore. His response caught the attention of a few nearby citizens. The guards expressed their understanding and explained that, thanks to the hard work of the principal and the academy staff, their city remained peaceful. They expressed their gratitude for the academy's protection. Yoo-won laughed awkwardly, feeling shy as he realized just how enormous the Union's influence was. The guards, noticing his unease, offered to help him. They pointed out that as a first year, he probably didn't know much about the city or how things worked, and if he needed assistance, they'd be happy to provide it. Amazed by their hospitality, Yoo-won asked if they really meant it. The guards proudly confirmed that it was their duty as city guards, and told him that if he was curious about anything, he should feel free to ask. Looking up at the sky, Yoo-won pointed to one of the flying cars and told the guards he'd like to get one of those. The guards followed his gaze to check what he was pointing at, and he asked them how much those flying cars cost. Later, Yoo-won was riding the fast vehicle, controlling it with excitement. As he sped toward the ground, he skillfully maneuvered it, and just before reaching a cliff, he made it soar into the air. Riding the flying vehicle filled him with joy, and he shouted, "This is freaking awesome." Before this, when he had asked the guards about the flying vehicles, they told him he was referring to a hoverbike. They mentioned that even the basic model costs 250,000 ronia, which was quite expensive. Yoo-won asked how much 250,000 ronia was worth and learned that it was indeed called a hoverbike. Without hesitation, he showed them a gold bar and asked if he could use it to buy a hoverbike. The guards were shocked at the sight of such a large gold bar and asked where he had gotten it, and if it was real. Yoo-won simply replied, "Yes, it's real." Now, as he excitedly rode his hoverbike, he figured out that a single gold bar was worth 7,500,000 ronia. Grateful, he thought he should thank his grandfather for giving it to him so recklessly. He then remembered his grandfather angrily shouting at him, reminding him that gold is valuable everywhere and to make sure to take it, while Yoo-won had complained that it was heavy and a hassle. Just then, Eve appeared to greet him. Yoo-won asked Eve what it thought of the bike and explained that it was a hoverbike infused with Yo and Gui, turning it into a living artifact. He named it Lilith, which he had created, and told Eve that they should get along well from now on. Eve happily agreed. Yoo-won then confirmed that he had gotten the liquor for Yumina and created Eve's little sibling, meaning he had completed all his errands. He figured it was time to head back to school. The next day, Yoo-won rested his dizzy, aching head on the table. A slight placed a glass of water beside him, disappointed, and remarked that he couldn't believe Yoo-won had gone out without a word after their meeting and returned hungover. Yoo-won apologized and explained that it was because of Yumina. He couldn't refuse. Rachel commented that he smelled like flowers, and he admitted it was his first time drinking. A slight told him that if he'd known that earlier, he wouldn't have waited or worried so much. Just then, Yeon noticed something and asked if the badge on his coat was the sign of the representative role he had gotten in return for drinking with Yumina. Yoo-won replied that the representative role was like being class president. A slight, somewhat resigned, said that since Yumina was in charge of the four of them, they would just have to accept it. But Yeon confidently declared that if anyone should represent the group, it should be her, shocking the others. Yeon explained her reasoning, saying that she was the strongest among them, and asked if Yoo-won agreed. But before he could respond, a slight interrupted, shouting for them to wait a second. He told Yeon that it was strange to frame things that way, as they were supposed to be equal comrades. He added that her attitude, acting like she was the best, wasn't good for their future tower climb. Furthermore, he didn't agree with her claim of being the strongest. Yeon just smiled and asked a slight if he really believed in equal comrades, especially since he had asked the professor the day before if they could climb the tower alone. She found it funny that he was the one talking about equality after that. A slight stood up in shock, his words from the previous day echoing back to him. Rachel stared at him with disappointment, and a slight panicked, trying to explain. He insisted that he was just curious and that it didn't mean he didn't want to team up with them. Yoo-won lay his head back on the desk, thinking there would be some animosity brewing from the morning class. He was about to suggest that they at least plan things out. but it seemed like their group was already off to a rough start. Scratching his head in frustration, he realized he didn't particularly want to be class president either, but now he understood why Yumina had chosen him out of the four. A Slight was remarkably clueless, yet his pride was ridiculously strong. Yoo-won was incredibly self-centered and strong, but bound to make enemies. And lastly, Rachel was surprisingly passive and didn't have the personality to lead or nurture others. He sighed in stress, thinking that the special admission students were definitely something else. Raising his hand, Yoo-won called for their attention, asking them to calm down and hear him out. He explained that a class president doesn't need to be the strongest, in fact, they shouldn't be. Yoo-won stared at him seriously and asked why not. Yoo-won replied, because if the strongest person is class president, they'll make all the decisions on their own. A class president, who is supposed to unite the class, can't do that. A Slight was surprised, Yoo-won was speechless, and Rachel looked confused. Yoo-won continued, explaining that a class president needs to be someone in the middle, someone who can offer fair and reasonable solutions for everyone. In that sense, he believed that someone easygoing, like him, should be class president. Yoo-won stood up and, surprisingly, agreed with him, though she also asked, did he just say he were easygoing? She then added that since Yumina had the authority to appoint the class president, she would go along with his reasoning for now. Relieved, Yoo-won thanked her. However, Yoo-won suddenly says that only person she really want to lead is him, which left Yoo-won confused. He asked what she meant by that, and she looked at a Slight and Rachel, replying that even if there's something that bothers her, if she want to get what she desire, she'll have to accept the unnecessary as well. She then walked away, saying she'd see them later, leaving Yoo-won trying to calm down a Slight, who was furious. Eventually, Yoo-won gave up and couldn't believe that the morning felt more like a battlefield than a normal day at school. He knew that pride was going to be an issue that would take time to resolve and convinced himself to be patient. But just then, Rachel excitedly called out to him, asking if the cute snake from earlier was gone because she really wanted to touch it. Yoo-won was shocked, thinking that this place was full of landmines. And so, Yoo-won's first day as class president of Class 11, filled with unique individuals, started off with difficulties. Just hours later, a huge man shouted to the professor that he was curious about the skills of the leftovers. The four of them stood on stage, facing an entire class. The professor explained that for their first lesson, they'd start with a light sparring session and asked the students what they thought. Class 1 students excitedly shouted, eager to take on the special class. Some teased the group, asking Yoo-won if he was going to take off his brooch in anger. A Slight commented that Union Academy divided students based on abilities, and as expected, Class 1 seemed to hate Class 11, the special class. Yoo-won agreed, thinking it was even worse than he anticipated and that perhaps his brooch had provoked the hostility. The biggest man in Class 1 glared at Yoo-won, furious that someone he considered weak was wearing a brooch from Professor Yumina, who was known as the goddess of flowers. The man, filled with rage, thought he would never acknowledge Yoo-won and shouted to the professor, demanding to test Yoo-won's skills personally. The entire room grew tense as students backed away in fear, but the professor simply replied that it sounded good. He then ordered Yoo-won to step up, announcing that he would be sparring with Erecto. Meanwhile, in her office, Yumina was busy at her desk, wondering why their class was having a joint session with the special class on the very first day, and why the first period was comprehensive practical combat. She knew there was no way a student from the lower dimension special admissions could spar with upper dimension students. It was likely that this was what the schedulers had in mind when they planned the curriculum, but something about the setup felt off to her. She sensed malice in this arrangement, suspecting it might be a prank or a deliberate challenge. Back on the stage, Yoo-won apologized to the professor, explaining that his combat skills were still lacking, and he didn't think there was anything he could gain from the match. The professor simply asked him if that was so and then added, -3 points, which surprised Yoo-won. The professor told him to come out, dismissing his words as an excuse. Yoo-won, confused and frustrated, wondered why the professor was acting this way. Was he dragging him out just to humiliate him in front of everyone? Yoo-won then responded, clarifying that it wasn't an excuse, it was a fact. He explained that he was accepted as a special admission student because of his unique abilities, not his combat skills. He suggested that if the professor was curious about his abilities, it would make more sense to assess them another way rather than forcing him into a fight. The professor, clearly angry, clenched his teeth and shouted, asking if Yoo-won was trying to teach him how to do his job. Yoo-won calmly replied that whether one was a professor or a student, everyone has to learn what they don't know. He asked the professor if he was right in assuming that the professor was an assistant professor. Enraged, the professor yelled, -5 points, leaving Yoo-won sighing in frustration, realizing how the professor planned to handle the situation. Trying to change the course, Yoo-won raised his finger and suggested that they take a week as preparation time and have the sparring match next week. The professor, surprised, paused, and Yoo-won continued, explaining that if he could just take that week to prepare and enter the tower once, he thought his preparations would be nearly complete. The room fell silent as the students processed what he said. They couldn't believe he was suggesting that in just 1 week, he'd be ready to face the special class. Some of the students whispered among themselves, wondering how someone with such low abilities could even think that 1 more week would change anything. One of the stronger students from Class 1, the strong lady, took notice of him. The professor, shaking with anger at being ignored, was frustrated that Yoo-won seemed to be setting the schedule as he pleased. But surprisingly, the professor agreed, saying, "That sounds good." Yoo-won wondered what the professor was planning to do, especially since he was just an assistant professor, not a full one. The professor called Yoo-won and Erecto over, announcing that next Tuesday, they would have an official sparring match. He added that the match would be fully public and broadcast live, so the entire academy would be able to watch it. Yoo-won realized that the professor wasn't just trying to humiliate him, he was setting up a spectacle to make it a major event. The professor then teasingly warned Yoo-won, saying that since he had asked for preparation time, he had better show his abilities. But before the professor could finish his sentence, Yoo-won cut him off with a calm, "Sure." He then called out to Erecto, which made the professor shake in full anger. Yoo-won told Erecto that they had an official match next week and that he was looking forward to it. Erecto, annoyed, spit on the ground and muttered, "Annoying." Though Erecto's response angered Yoo-won, he remained calm, as he hadn't expected a polite reply. What he really wanted was to confirm Erecto's stats using his all-seeing eye. As expected from a student in the special class, Erecto's stats were impressive. Yoo-won confirmed that Erecto's life and body stats were absurdly high. His life was 5 times greater and his body 10 times stronger than Yoo-won's. But even so, when Yoo-won compared Erecto's stats to Aslight's and Rachel's, he realized that, in comparison to them, he was still nothing. Yoo-won knew that if he wanted to climb the tower with his teammates, he needed to surpass Erecto's level. Turning to Aslight and Rachel, he asked why they looked so gloomy and if they were worried about him. But before they could answer, someone interrupted, asking what was wrong and if no one was stepping up. Yoo-won looked around and saw Yeon stretching on the stage. She told Class 1 that, unlike their class president, she specialized in combat, then asked if they weren't curious about the skills of the special admissions students. Yoo-won couldn't believe what he was seeing and hearing. Yeon was openly challenging the enemy. She tied her white hair up with a hair tie and confidently told Class 1 that she was more than willing to accept a sparring challenge. However, the students of Class 1 remained silent, nervously sweating as they stared at her. Even the professor looked panicked and couldn't stop her. The silence didn't surprise Yoo-won, as his all-seeing eyes couldn't fully grasp the extent of Yeon's strength, and he knew there was no way Class 1 couldn't sense her overwhelming aura. Yeon, noticing the silence, taunted them, asking if she should lower herself since they lacked confidence. Pointing at Erecto, she asked if he was the type to hold back and challenged him to come out, saying she would crush him. Erecto clenched his teeth in anger, but he didn't respond. Yoo-won noticed that Erecto was terrified. Erecto had originally targeted him, but now he was being challenged by someone he didn't expect. Everyone else probably realized this too, and if Erecto backed down from Yeon's provocation, it would destroy his pride. He'd be left injured in more ways than one, and there was no way he would recover in a week. Although it wasn't really Yoo-won's concern, he didn't want things to escalate, so he quickly rushed over to Yeon, telling her not to do it. He apologized for interrupting and explained that Erecto already had a sparring match with him next week. He told her that if she wanted to fight Erecto, she would have to wait her turn. Yeon looked back at him, surprised, and asked if he was sure. Yoo-won replied, yes, thanking her for checking on him but telling her that he needed to prove his worth with his own abilities. Yeon was surprised by his words, but then she turned around, saying she had thought he was just someone who relied on tricks, but now she guessed he had a bit of manliness in him. She agreed to let him handle things his way. However, she wasn't done with Class 1. Addressing them again, she asked if anyone else would step up to spar with her. When no one responded, she sighed in disappointment and turned to leave, sarcastically commenting that Class 1 had been barking so loudly just a moment ago, but now that a real threat had appeared, they were groveling on the ground. Class 11 burst into laughter at her words, while Class 1 fumed with anger but couldn't do anything. Suddenly, one of the Class 1 students spoke up, asking Yeon who she was calling dogs. He sneered, saying that it's always the weak and foolish who band together in packs, growling as they pretend to protect their little groups. He stared directly at Yeon as he spoke, clearly trying to provoke her. Yoo-won observed the man on stage, wondering what made him stand out. Even among the special class, this person seemed to be on another level. Aslight explained that the man was Ordima, the ruler of the Kedius dimension. Curious, Yoo-won asked what Ordima and Kedius were. Aslight was surprised at the question and explained that, aside from the Union, there were 10 dimensions with the highest hierarchies, and Ordima's family ruled one of them, Kedius. As Ordima walked down the stage, changing into his combat uniform, Yoo-won asked if Ortama was from one of the top 10 families across all dimensions. The slight confirmed it. Ortama took his place on stage to face Yoo-won, signaling to the professor. The professor quickly set up a recording device. Rachel asked what it was, and a slight explained that it was for filming a public video, possibly to be shared later. When Yoo-won asked what would happen after the recording, a slight mentioned that everything would be shared on the internet, although he wasn't completely sure what that entailed. Yoo-won realized that this world's internet functioned similarly to what he knew. He pulled out his phone and connected to the internet, which led a slight to ask how he knew about it, given that he was from a lower dimension. Yoo-won explained that in his world, the internet was a growing development, and he searched for the school's internet on his phone. Rachel pointed to a live channel, showing that it was broadcasting their class in real time. Yoo-won thanked her, appreciating her quick find. As they watched the live feed, Yoo-won realized that the professor was likely trying to embarrass them by making the fight public, but he doubted it would go as planned. On stage, Yoo-won and Ortama squared off, their overwhelming auras filling the space. Ortama taunted Yoo-won, eager to begin, but Yoo-won remained unfazed, provoking Ortama by telling him to make the first move. This enraged Ortama, who raised his hand, ready to show his power. As he did so, a heavy pressure spread across the stage, dragging everyone down. Yoo-won felt the force and realized that this was no ordinary power. It was as if natural law itself was bending to Ortama's will, forcing everything and everyone to submit as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Yoo-won quietly remarked that it felt like a distortion of natural law. A slight, hearing this, was surprised and asked if Yoo-won had figured out the principle behind Ortama's ability. Before Yoo-won could respond, Rachel, visibly shaken, clung to his arm, her eyes fixed on the stage. Yoo-won, seemingly unaffected by Ortama's display of power, began to release her own energy, gathering it effortlessly. She unleashed it with a flick of her hand, instantly shattering Ortama's power. Everyone, including a slight, was stunned. Ortama's power had been completely nullified with nothing more than a simple release of Yoo-won's energy. Ortama, visibly irritated, acknowledged that Yoo-won had some skills, but she dismissed him, saying that his power was as ridiculous as the horns on his head. If that was all he had, she was disappointed. Ortama responded calmly, assuring her that this wasn't all he had to offer. Raising his hand, he prepared to launch another attack. But Yoo-won was quicker. She dashed toward him, landing a powerful kick to his stomach and pinning him to the ground. Ortama was caught off guard but managed to ask if she really thought he'd let it happen again, referring to his ability getting stronger the closer his opponent got. Frustrated, he unleashed another attack, admitting that it was annoying to have to use both hands against someone like her. However, Yoo-won had already moved behind him, whispering that if he lacked brains, his body would have to work harder. In a fit of anger, Ortama swung his fist backward, calling her arrogant, but Yoo-won ducked down and evaded the strike effortlessly. She grabbed his collar with one hand, stopped his arm with the other, and then delivered a swift kick to his chin, mocking his stiff and clumsy movements. She leaped back and taunted him again, asking if someone needed to spoon-feed him as well. Enraged, Ortama attempted to punch her, calling her names, but Yoo-won easily dodged his attack. A slight, stunned by the spectacle, couldn't believe that Yoo-won was overwhelming Ortama, the ruler of Kidius. Yoo-won, observing the fight closely, remarked that Ortama was used to suppressing his opponent's movements with his distortion of natural law ability, which wasn't working against Yoo-won. As Ortama failed to land a single hit, Yoo-won countered with a flurry of punches and a powerful kick to Ortama's face. Yoo-won explained to a slight that Ortama's method wasn't effective against Yoo-won. Ortama had overwhelming physical power and abilities, but it was obvious that he rarely used his body in combat. A slight, still in disbelief, realized that Yoo-won was seeing things with a remarkable level of insight. Watching Yoo-won fight on equal footing with Ortama and Yoo-won grasping the principles behind both fighters' abilities, a slight knew for certain that these two special admissions students from the lower dimension were something far beyond ordinary. Ortama, beaten and enraged, demanded to know how Yoo-won dared insult him like that. In response, Yoo-won punched him in the face again, mockingly asking if he had come to fight or just wag his tongue, and if the latter, perhaps she should cut it off since it seemed too long. Ortama, furious, began to release thunderous energy, surprising Yoo-won. He slammed both of his fists into the ground in rage, cracking the floor while cursing her. Fortunately, Yoo-won jumped out of the way just in time to avoid the attack. Ortama, now releasing a powerful surge of thunder energy, furiously shouted at Yoo-won, demanding to know how she dared humiliate him. He screamed that he would never forgive her and, if she wished to die so much, he would grant her that wish right now. Yoo-won simply gathered her power in her hand, calmly telling Ortama that death wasn't a concept someone like him should talk about. With her energy tightly clenched, she dashed toward him. Ortama, filled with rage, gathered his own power and hurled it toward her, shouting for her to die. Just as they were about to collide, Yumina appeared, clapping her hands and stopping them both in their tracks. A swarm of flowers suddenly bloomed around them, forcing them to halt, leaving them both shocked as a literal garden of blooming flowers appeared around them. Confused, they both looked down at the flowers, then back at Yumina, who told them that at the academy, students weren't encouraged to fight for their lives and should save such battles for the tower. She asked if they understood, and her tone left no room for argument. The stage had transformed into a vibrant garden because of Yumina's power. With a flick of her fingers, the flowers slowly vanished. Yoo-won, watching from a distance, was stunned and wondered if it had all been an illusion. But the scent of flowers lingering in the air told him otherwise. Ortama, gritting his teeth in anger, turned and walked away. Yoo-won, impressed, complimented Yumina's strength, but Yumina only smiled in response, which seemed to calm her down. Yoo-won sighed, walking back to her team, where Yoo-won greeted her. She asked how he had found the battle, and he replied that it was incredible and that just watching it had been really helpful. Suddenly, Rachel hugged Yoo-won from behind. Surprised, he turned to ask her what was wrong, noticing that she was trembling and staring at Yoo-won. Concerned, he asked if she was still scared of Yoo-won. Blushing, he found her reaction endearing and comforted her, telling her everything was fine. Meanwhile, Yoo-won silently observed, her expression unreadable. At that moment, Yumina's voice cut through the air as she reprimanded Assistant Professor Farrell. She angrily declared that his actions deserved punishment, pointing out that from the very first class, he had tried to get away with letting a sparring session escalate uncontrollably while standing by and watching. Farrell, sweating nervously, stammered out an apology, but Yumina made it clear that an apology wasn't enough and that he should prepare for the consequences. Yumina then walked over to Yoo-won, fixing his badge, and reminded him that, as class president, maintaining dignity was important. She playfully chastised him for wearing his badge upside down, shocking the Class 1 students who had been watching. As she walked away, she wished everyone a good day, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with tension. The Class 1 students, still angry, glared at Yoo-won. He sighed and remarked to his classmates that while their professor had come to stop the fight, she had only managed to stir things up even more. The next day, the internet was buzzing with talk about the new student from the lower dimension who had held his own against Ortama. Many were shocked and couldn't believe the rumors. Some users noted how attractive the special admissions students were, while Ortama's supporters defended him, claiming he was still the top student of the year. However, those who had seen the live broadcast urged others to check the internet post made by Professor Farrell, which contained footage of the fight between Ortama and Yoo-won. The video left many amazed, while others struggled to believe what they were seeing. Some were puzzled when they saw Yoo-won speaking to Farrell during the match, wondering why he was bargaining with the professor. But when the video showed Yumina stopping the fight and sweetly fixing Yoo-won's badge, panic spread through the student body. Questions about Yoo-won's identity flooded the internet. Who was he, where did he come from, and why had Yumina, the academy's beloved professor, shown him such personal attention? In the canteen, Yoo-won was reading the comments on the internet, telling his team that the whole world seemed to be talking about them. Yoo-won found it strange, while a slight admitted that he couldn't understand a single word of internet slang. Yoo-won questioned whether the person she had just fought was really supposed to be the top prospect, expressing doubt. She believed there was at least one person in that class more capable than Ortama and thought he would have been sharp enough to notice it. Yoo-won, shrugging and laughing, explained that he had been too focused on her sparring match to notice anything else, and he, too, didn't understand much of the internet slang. A slight then pointed out that Yoo-won's name was all over the school's community and asked what terms like bargaining master and Myeong-jae-jeon SSC meetup even meant. Yoo-won laughed and said that since they couldn't touch the person who challenged the top prospect, they were venting their frustrations by targeting him instead. Yoo-won asked if that meant not everyone was talking about it. But before anyone could respond, a slight interrupted, glancing to the side and asking if Rachel had always been that distant from them. They noticed Rachel sitting a little farther away, staring at her food, trembling slightly and keeping her head down in silence. Yoo-won guessed that Rachel was still nervous around Yoo-won, unable to get closer to her. He wondered how they managed to share the same room and speculated that Rachel might still be on edge from earlier. Thinking that a little sweetness might help ease the tension, Yoo-won decided to act. He pulled something out of his inventory, announcing that they should check it out. It was a special elixir jam made from his ability, concentrated from thousands of fruits, with a special effect that promoted overall stat growth. Yoo-won and the slight-eyed the jar curiously. Yoo-won opened it and told them they'd be amazed, asking for some bread. Rachel, from her spot in the distance, caught the aroma from the jam and was so surprised that she dropped her bread. She looked toward the source of the smell and saw Yoo-won offering bread spread with jam to a slight and Yoo-won. Both a Slight and Yoo-won tasted the bread and were immediately amazed. A Slight, stuttering, asked how something could taste that good, while Yoo-won, speechless, savored the wonderful flavor. Yoo-won casually asked if they liked it. A Slight, overwhelmed, told him it was beyond good, while Yoo-won, still eating, mentioned that she had tasted all kinds of sweets from the Central Plains, but his jam was on a whole different level. Feeling a bit awkward, Yoo-won told them they could just say it was delicious. Noticing Yoo-won staring at the jam on her bread, Yoo-won then called out to Rachel, inviting her to join them. After a brief pause, she dragged her chair closer and shyly asked if he could make her one as well. Yoo-won replied that it was easy, and he handed her a piece of bread with the jam. When Rachel tasted it, her face lit up, and she happily exclaimed that it was like tasting the essence of the fruit itself, the most delicious fruit flavor she had ever experienced. A Slight then asked if Yoo-won had made the jam with his ability, while Yoo-won asked if she could have more. Yoo-won, smiling, told them they could have as much as they liked. After finishing her bread, Yoo-won mentioned that she felt like she was eating something way too precious, but Yoo-won reassured her, saying it wasn't anything special or expensive. He explained that, since they were a team, it was best to share good things and told her to consider it a return favor for the kindness she had shown him earlier. Still, Yoo-won felt it was too much, while Rachel happily enjoyed her bread. Suddenly, Yoo-won stood up with determination, shouting that she had made up her mind. Grabbing Yoo-won's tie, she declared that in return for the elixir jam, she would personally teach him martial arts. Just a minute later, Yoo-won transported them somewhere new. She told him that as long as she had enough space to move her body, it would be fine. She was surprised to find a place like this, which gave off a strange sense of calm. Yoo-won remarked that the training room must reflect their psychological environment, noting that he expected something of this quality from the union class. He then asked what she was planning to teach him, as they had left in the middle of eating to come there. Yoo-won simply replied that the place was sufficient and began swinging a wooden sword while approaching him, warning him not to move carelessly, which shocked him. She informed him they would start with a basic thrust. Yoo-won pushed the wooden sword forward, her movements fluid, the tip of the blade stopping just inches from Yoo-won's face. She explained that this was a thrust, a move without hesitation or doubt. The precision and speed of the strike were almost inhuman, and in that brief instant, Yoo-won discovered a new concept. He wondered why he had caught on to penetration and if it was connected to swordsmanship. Yoo-won, noticing his distraction, called his name repeatedly, asking if he was listening. Snapping back to reality, Yoo-won apologized for zoning out. She told him to focus and explained that a thrust doesn't exist in just one form. It can be done with anything, and what she was showing him was the most basic and fundamental meaning of a thrust. Yoo-won demonstrated again, stabbing the sword repeatedly while asking him to consider how many times he thrusts, from where, and what he mimics when doing so. Ultimately, she asked him to think about the force or aura behind the thrust. She then swung the sword back and aimed the tip at his neck. Yoo-won explained that there were countless variations of the thrust, but the basics were always the same. She reminded him that this was just one move, a thrust. Yoo-won noticed that Yoo-won, having mastered a single concept to its utmost, conveyed a depth that felt far greater than mixing several concepts together. He guessed that, for her, this mastery represented the essence of the thrust. She then handed him the sword and asked if he wanted to give it a try. Yoo-won, accepting the challenge, replied, "Sure." He stretched his arms, warning her that it would be a clumsy imitation, asking her to bear with him. Yoo-won chuckled, remarking that if he could perfectly copy her from the start, it would make the years she had spent mastering it meaningless. Then, to her surprise, the tip of Yoo-won's wooden sword appeared near her, stopping just inches away, causing a strong force that startled her. She stared at him, wondering if he had truly grasped the concept after seeing it only once. Yet, Yoo-won was frustrated, realizing that what he had done wasn't quite what she had taught him. He told himself to focus, understanding that he couldn't replicate her technique completely. He also realized that, until now, he had been too focused on mixing concepts together, thinking he could only strengthen them by combining or adding new elements. But now, he figured out that his power could grow stronger by refining what he already had. As he repeated the thrusts with the wooden sword, he considered the many characters representing thrust in different languages and concepts. He wondered why penetration was the one that stuck with him. He realized that, for Yoo-won, a thrust wasn't just about form, it was about piercing its target without fail, making it a deadly and decisive move. Yoo-won, surprised by Yoo-won's progress, shouted for him to stop, telling him there was no need to push himself too hard right from the start. Exhausted, Yoo-won let go of the sword and kneeled on the ground. She reminded him that if he remembered what she had shown him, he should try it again later, in a larger space and against an opponent he could actually defeat. He nodded in agreement, but before he could fully process what had happened, a swarm of system notifications appeared around him, leaving him shocked and confused. The system informed him that he had understood and internalized the concept of penetration, as well as martial arts, with swordsmanship now absorbed as a sub-concept of martial arts. He was bewildered. Had his stats really increased just from swinging a sword a few times? His surprise only grew when he saw that his stats had skyrocketed. The system displayed his updated abilities. His depth in the all-seeing eye increased to 110, martial arts to 36, swordsmanship to 20, and penetration to 16. He couldn't believe it. Penetration, a concept he had just gained, was already at 16, and swordsmanship, which hadn't risen even after defeating countless goblins, had jumped to 20. Realizing his combat abilities had essentially doubled, Yoo-won questioned if such rapid improvement was even possible. Yoo-won, impressed but slightly frustrated, remarked that she hadn't expected to be outdone so quickly. She was astonished that he had grasped the essence of the technique so effortlessly, free from the form of a weapon. Surprised by her reaction, Yoo-won explained that he had only followed her movements without fully realizing it. Annoyed, Yoo-won pointed out that if simply demonstrating something made it easy to master, no one would ever struggle to achieve mastery. He admitted that she was right but jokingly suggested that maybe it was because her teaching was just that good, causing her to blush in embarrassment. Yoo-won, seeing her reaction, clarified that he wasn't just flattering her. For the first time, watching her movements, he had sensed a profound depth behind them, and it had left him wondering if a person could really train to such a high level. He became so absorbed in the moment that he lost track of time. Yoo-won, still blushing and unable to believe what she was hearing, turned away. She thought about how little time they had known each other, yet he said such things so easily. Yoo-won added that her teaching was truly remarkable, and in exchange, he would handle the elixir for her from now on. But Yoo-won, not fully convinced, remarked that it hardly made up for what she had taught him today. Yoo-won, shocked, asked what else he should do, but Yoo-won simply smiled and told him not to worry. However, her warm smile left him stunned when she added that she would make up for today's loss over time, and that he should be prepared. Yoo-won froze for a moment, realizing the gravity of her words. She snapped him out of his daze, reminding him that it was time for the next lecture. Still shaken, Yoo-won stuttered in agreement. Yoo-won teleported first, and as he followed, he couldn't help but marvel at the fact that Yoo-won could show such a kind and playful expression. Meanwhile, in the corridor, Rachel and a Slight were walking together, both focused on their phones. A group of students stood ahead of them, and one of the male students noticed Rachel. He stepped in front of her, causing her to stop in surprise. Confused, Rachel looked up as the man asked her where she was from, leaving her uncertain and unsure of how to respond.